According to Paul Joannou, Newcastle United's official club historian, Newcastle West End and Newcastle East End football clubs did not merge to form Newcastle United. In fact, Newcastle United wasn't formed in 1892. What a revelation. So when were they formed, and what was the circumstances of that formation? And why did Newcastle United, the club themselves, perpetuate the story of this initial foundation of Newcastle? And why did they decide to celebrate the centenary in 1992? It's coming up. Welcome back, it's Eddie here from Tyneside Life. So, like most of you, I've been sold on the idea that Newcastle United were formed in 1892 when Newcastle East End and Newcastle West End merged to form Newcastle United. I've done 2 stadium tours in the last 12 months that perpetuated this particular story. There's merchandise everywhere, and badges and pins and scarves, and all. There's this 1892 members club, all telling us that 1892 was the foundation of Newcastle United. That foundation story is there for you to see and read in black and white, no pun intended. There's going to be hundreds of you out there with 1892 tattooed on your body. So sit down, get yourself a cup of tea, because you're going to need it. Now, this is no dark secret. It isn't as if this hasn't been talked about before. Paul Joannou himself talks about this, and he's written about it in books and articles and in interviews as recently as May, June 2021 about the real story of Newcastle United's history. So I'm doing this story because I think our history needs a bit more airing of this true story, because what we don't want to do is forget those years of Newcastle United's history. Now, Paul Joannou has dedicated his life as the official club historian to learn about the history of Newcastle United by delving into the historical records, delving into the archives, looking at the Football Association notes and meeting minutes and newspaper articles. He is probably the quintessential expert of Newcastle United's history. And today I've actually spoken to Paul on the phone just to tighten up some loose ends of things I didn't quite understand. So what you're about to watch now is the actual true story of Newcastle United's foundation history. So why am I stood here outside St Peter's Social Club here in South Byker, about 200 or 300 metres from the River Tyne just down there? Well, this location here is the birthplace and foundation of Newcastle United's history in 1881 as Stanley FC. Let's hear about that story. In 1881, Newcastle was benefiting from the height of the Industrial Revolution under Queen Victoria. The River Tyne was full of ships and barges transporting coal from nearby pits and other cargo. The swing bridge had been open for 5 years, allowing ships to travel further up and down the river to Elsick and Scotswood works of Vickers Armstrong. Great factories that employed thousands of men and women. This was a time that put Newcastle on the map as the industrial centre of Europe and gave the locals the nickname the Geordies. It was in November 1881 that members of the Stanley Cricket Club became interested in this new game of football, and so in a nearby confectioner's in South Byker, a meeting was held. From it, 19-year-old William Coulson, William Findlay and Joseph Simpson set up Stanley Football Club. On the 26th of November that year, William Coulson captained the side in their first match against Elsick Leatherworks Reserves and beat them 5-0. Initially, Stanley FC played in blue shirts on a pitch on or very near to where St Peter's Social Club is now, on Stanley Street. This street no longer exists. Stanley FC affiliated with other local establishments as it competed in the Northern League and FA Cup and changed its colours to a red shirt and white shorts, or knickers as they were called then. In October 1882, the club changed its name to Newcastle East End, and in 1990, the club became a limited company and share issues were launched. During the next few years, the club was becoming very popular and was famed for Alec White, who was a leading goal scorer. He scored 9 goals in one game in 1887, and Newcastle East End won the local North East treble in the 88-89 season. And so at the beginning of 1892, Newcastle East End's bitter rivals, Newcastle West End, were getting themselves into some real financial difficulties. And in the May of 1892, Newcastle West End, in its own entirety, completely folded and collapsed. Newcastle East End decided to take advantage of that and moved to a city centre location and took over the lease of St James's Park. Of course, St James's Park looks nothing like it does today. It's only looked like that for about the last 23 years. In 1892, it was just a field with some lines on and some wooden barriers. In fact, the players, I've been told, used to go to a GP's flat in Leazer's Terrace to get changed. But what Newcastle East End did do is take advantage of the collapse of the West End and salvage some of the assets, i.e. they took on some of their players, one or two of the directors. But what happened next? Having just left a pitch on Chillingham Road and scavenged some assets from Newcastle West End, Newcastle East End began their new life at St James's Park in May 1892. They were rejected that year from entering the Football League, but they also had another problem. There was some bad feeling now with Newcastle East End now occupying St James's Park, and so they set about finding a new name for the club. In a meeting on the 9th of December 1892, new names were discussed. Newcastle Rangers and Newcastle City was considered, but eventually, after 6 months in their new home, Newcastle East End decided to call themselves Newcastle United in a move to unite the city behind one club. It wasn't until 1895, 3 years later, that this name was officially registered with the Football League, having been accepted into Division 2 in 1893. Newcastle United continued to play in red shirts until August 94, when, due to a clash with other clubs playing in red, Newcastle decided to adopt black and white stripes with 2-inch stripes, and the rest is history. Interestingly, in St James's Metro station, it has old photos of Newcastle United on the walls. One of them has a black and white photo of the team in black and white shirts, and underneath it states, "First team photograph, 1892. This is, of course, impossible, as they didn't change to black and white stripes until 1894. Pull your finger out, Nexus. If you look at Wikipedia, it claims that Newcastle East End also had a second strip of red and white stripes. There is absolutely no historical record of this, and this is just likely to be some mischief with the online site. So, Newcastle United didn't form in 1892. 1892 is merely the year that Newcastle East End moved to St James's Park, having already moved a few times already, and then renamed themselves to Newcastle United several months later. Their second name change. If you'd like to see more videos on Newcastle United history, including Newcastle West End, just hit the subscribe button. So now it comes back to, why did Newcastle United perpetuate the myth that Newcastle United was formed in 1892 after the merger of East End and West End? Well, you have to go back to 1981. That should have been the centenary celebrations, 100 years of Newcastle United. But the club at the time were going through some real difficult times. They'd been in the second division for 4 or 5 seasons. The club was in disarray, real financial difficulties, and they've cocked up. Basically, they've made a boob. I've chatted about this with Paul Joannou, the club historian, and it seems that either through ignorance or just forgot, or they just didn't want to celebrate the centenary, it just bypassed us altogether. Of course, the next important milestone in Newcastle's history was 1992, because that was the 100-year celebration of when Newcastle East End moved to St James's Park and when Newcastle East End changed their name to Newcastle United. Of course, a very important year, but not the year of Newcastle United's formation. Now, Newcastle United have set themselves a trap. They've kind of cornered themselves here, because by celebrating a centenary in 1992, everything just exploded and kicked off, and there was a tidal wave of 1892 merchandise and pins and badges and scarves and tattoos, and the 1892 Members Club, all of which couldn't be stopped. And if you are still desperate to disregard historical facts, take this into consideration. Think of the likes of Man United. Their official foundation is 1878, and they were named Newton Heath. It wasn't until 1902 they changed their name to Man United. You look at Arsenal, who were formed in 1886. They were initially named as Dial Square, then changed their name to Woolwich Arsenal, and a few years later to Arsenal. You look at Man City, they were formed in 1880, as St Mark's didn't change their name to Man City till 1894. So if it's good enough for those big clubs to set their foundation year at the very beginning under old names, I think Newcastle United should as well. We are forgetting about 11 really important historical years for the history of Newcastle United. Look, 1892 was a really important year for the history of Newcastle United, but Newcastle United did not form in 1892. If you want to celebrate 1892, knock yourself out. Nobody can argue otherwise, but Newcastle United were formed in 1881 as Stanley FC, and I think that's really important. Who here thinks we should start the 1881 club? Put your hands up.